And so, Joseph Feaster Jr., let's talk about childhood memories. Let's talk about what it was like in your neighborhood, what was going down in your neighborhood. Let's talk about school. Who and what inspired you during those childhood days?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Motley. I always like to reflect back to my childhood because I think that it was that grounding that I received at that time that made me the man that I am today. I grew up in New York. I always tell one, and I always start by saying I'm a total New Yorker, born in the Bronx, raised in Queens, worked in Brooklyn, and partied in Manhattan. And for the Staten Island folks, yes, we left you out then, and I do now as well. But my formative years, I grew up. I was raised until I was 5 years old in the Bronx, New York, and then we moved to East Elmhurst, New York. And I didn't realize, in terms of that the racial differences that existed in my community at such a tender age, because I moved there at 5 years old. But I noticed that initially when I moved in, there were white families on my street, and within 2 years, the entire neighborhood had changed to almost predominantly black. There was one family that stayed even almost up to the 2000s, Mr. Glass, but he was about the only one that remained in the neighborhood. But my rearing was my father was a cab driver. My mother was a housewife. She was a homemaker. I have two sisters, and my mother always talked about education. So one of the things in New York, some of the schools that were predominantly outside of the exam schools, the ones that were predominant educationally were some of the Catholic schools. So I attended Catholic school for 12 years, and had my communion, my confirmation, and I always like to brag that I had the confirmation with Harry Belafonte's oldest daughter, and I have a picture of him there. I didn't understand his significance at the time, being only 9 years old, but nonetheless, we went there. I went on to high school to Mater Christi, which is in Astoria, New York, which was a diocesan high school, and then at that time matriculated from there when I was applying to schools and said I wanted to attend law school. I went to an organization called the National Scholarship Fund for Negro Students. And Northeastern University was beginning its initial College of Criminal Justice first class, and they sent scholarship down, and next year I know I was heading up 95. Just want to go back for a minute in terms of some things while I was rearing. Had an opportunity. I call myself a YMCA kid. Used to go to the Y every Saturday. I learned judo. I learned we had the Flash Gordon movies. I learned basketball. I learned we played dodgeball the real way because you got hit with the dodgeball when I was growing up. It'll knock you out, not the tougher balls that they got now. I ran track most of my career and still like track as an athlete. Studied judo. Used to give demonstrations throughout the city of Boston, the city of New York in terms of judo. Was in the Sea Cadets where, marched in parades in New York. So I stayed all of that just to say that I was a kid. I went to camp, during the summer to Minnesink and a certain experience I think that young people should have. So that was what was the grounding for me, Dr. Motley, as I grew up in New York.
Well, as I listen to you, there's so many parallels in our, childhood. I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I was part of the public school system there. However, my first relationship with education began in the church, where Miss Kathleen Davis, my Sunday school teacher, told me I was the most brilliant individual in the world. I already had heard that from my parents and my family. And then when I walked in and I met Mrs. Somerville, one of my teachers in school, and she happened to be a white teacher, my first encounter with a white teacher in the public schools. And Mrs. Somerville told me I was brilliant. it sort of confirmed for me all of what I had been told before, and it made you want to passionately work within that whole system of education. It wasn't until sixth grade when I fell in love with Mrs. Nicholas, my first teacher in school, who happened to be an African American woman. We would fight over who would be the one to carry her books to her car after school. And Mrs. Fowler, my principal, who made sure that I was able to play the violin and do it without any of my boys teasing me about the fact that I played the violin. When Herr Facchetti, my instructor, told me, because lots of folk in Pittsburgh are German, said to me, the next time they tease you, ask them to play it. And when they can't play it, don't smile or don't laugh at them. Just tell them there are lessons available to learn. And so I had an eclectic mix of individuals, but all of the exposure opportunities that have led to my always knowing that education was a key to opportunity in the future for both me and my family, and that you had to model what it meant to learn and get into the school and classroom and take that kind of seriously, because teachers were treasure. And they had this treasure that if you sat with them, as I tried to do with every one of my teachers, find a way to have conversations with them that some would say in those days were above our years. And so while we were in a school that was predominantly white initially, and of course, as you mentioned, you would constantly see the neighborhood change. Your Mr. Glass was my Mr. Shoemaker.
Okay.
Mr. Shoemaker lived right next door to me. But Mr. Shoemaker exposed me to fishing. He would take the same guy that used to yell out the window at him, shoemaker, boo maker, big fat who maker, and hide, and tease him as a little boy. And he would take me fishing and take me and teach me and help me get my first job at W.T. Grant's. And so while I had a whole neighborhood and a church and a family and a mom and uncles and pops and all of them who were making sure that the school became sort of a sanctuary for me. It allowed me to do theater. It allowed me to do music. It allowed me to take what I already knew how to do. I learned to read before I went to school. I started school at 4, didn't know that I was younger than everybody else. So I was always the smallest person in my classroom, believe it or not, when you look at this 6'7" person that I am today, until about 8th grade. And then I started to grow and catch up a little bit. And it wasn't until 10th grade that I passed everyone. But I was always the little guy that they used to take along with them. And I didn't even know that I was, in some cases, 2 years younger, because during that period of desegregation in schools and all that, there was tracking and all other kinds of things going on in the schools. We didn't know it was tracking. You just knew that, Johnny was on the first floor of the school down in the basement, and you were on the top floor of the school, and Johnny didn't know the same teachers that you knew. And when you saw Johnny, it always looked like he was playing. And every time you looked in one of the other classrooms, it looked like you were learning something new, and it was a privilege to that.
Well,
that we didn't understand at that time.
Just listening to you just reminded me 2 things I want us both to talk about is our family's influence on that. I got to start there, in terms, because while I'm not an educator, I'm married to an educator. I know you very well, and I respect educators, but the educational process to me is in serious trouble as I view it. So I want to just talk about how that did. And when you start, you started at 4, I started at 5. That's one of the reasons why I went to Catholic school, because in New York, and again, I'm about 8 years before you. What happens is that they started, you had to be 6 years old in
Yes.
order to start in the first
Yes.
grade.
Yes.
And I started, and so I graduated high school at 17. That was as a result of that. But that demographic that I talked about, interesting enough, I didn't knowingly run into any racial incidents or divide during my formative educational years in elementary school at all. None. I mean, there was Ronald Tester and Paul DeNegris and
And
all
the
of them.
demographic of that
Yes.
school was
Was in charge of predominantly, and well, it was a mix. It was a mix because the school that we went to, St. Gabriel's, was on 98th Street, which was almost you could almost say in the heart of the black community.
Right.
So the kids who came in from the 80s and the high 80s and lower 90s, because in terms of Catholic school, from the other neighborhoods, they would come there. Never had a problem there with regards to any, I don't know of a single racial incident. I do know of incidents where my sisters, who are older than me, 5 and 6 years older than me, whereby they would be invited to parties. My father go to pick them up. They're sitting on the stoop because one of the parents wouldn't allow them to come into the house. So they experienced it. My sisters did.
Did they realize at the time that they were experiencing that?
Don't know if because again, talking about that family unit my mother prepared us well to deal with life as it was. I think the answer is yes, but it didn't stifle what my sisters were able to do. I have a sister who, I mean, she went to Hunter High, Hunter College, and that was back in the 60s, top exam school in Manhattan. And so she did. My other sister went forward to pursue nursing. So I think that we were grounded in the sense of self-love. So it didn't affect us in terms of our maturation at all.
So when you were talking about never feeling any sense of being not included or feeling different, when you look back on it now from this mature set of eyes that you have, does this Joseph still feel that way? Because I know a lot of times when I examine it, I remember all the love that I was feeling. And on a personal basis, I wasn't feeling some of that kind of discrimination. But as I've become more mature and I look at some of my classmates, I realized how much they were going through that I wasn't paying attention to, because kids are kind of selfish.
Yes.
And, you're like, it's cool for me, I'm cool. I was captain of safety patrol, so I got out of school early to make sure people could cross the street. Mrs. Fowler had me drawing pictures in her office, even though I was one of the worst artists in the world. She was encouraging me. I was the cover page of the play. And my mother looked at it and said, when your mother tells you, I think your brother could have done a better job, the picture wasn't that good. But Miss Fowler loved me enough to do that. But that wasn't the case and for a lot of the students who, now as I reflected back on their experience, what it was like for them. Have you ever had that recursive learning experience where you go back and look at something and say, felt good then, but when I look around, it was sort of a little different than it may have felt on a personal basis?
Again, it's a lot of what you're mentioning parallels my own experience in terms of what a teacher would do. But I think what you're actually saying is, we were just exceptional kids.
With exposure opportunities.
That's exactly right. And we were able to communicate a sense with those adults where they didn't. Now, I went to Catholic school. I had nuns up until the 5th grade. After that, they separated boys and girls. 6th grade through 12th grade. Even in my high school, they patrolled up and down the middle, and even in lunchroom. So we were separate. There were no girls in my class after that period of time. So I had nuns, and like you said, Sister Annunciata, third grade. You remember these people. Brother Paul,
Yeah.
you know
Took
that.
care of you.
Oh yeah. Well, in terms of Brother Paul, he was the vice principal in the high school at Marta Christi.
So
You know,
you're going to take the SWATs, or you're going
well, that's
to.
right. If you got caught, I mean, when I got put out of the classroom, I'd be trying to hide by the so that he wouldn't see me as he was patrolling the hall because he knew you were put out by the teacher. So I wasn't an angel, but I was academically sound. I was respectful. I was, like you, involved in the activities. I did a special program around computers in 1964. They had, 65 it was. They had, a phone at my house. I connect to a computer, and they would say 2 times 2 equals 4. This was before, this was with IBM. I was in a play. Sang in the Glee Club. That's why I sing so low now, LOW. That's what I sing so low. So we were engaged, we were involved, we were academic. That's going to propel us on. Yes, I ran into my first experience with a negative racial interaction is when I went down to my high school and I'm walking up the block, in order to, because we had to take an exams, walking up the blocks and a Spalding whizzes past my head. So I figured someone it went out errant. I picked it up, threw it back. Fine. Came back down the hill. My good buddy Eddie Alonso and me were heading to the buses. I get down there. These guys come out of nowhere, threw garbage cans, broke the bus window, etc. In fact, the bus driver pulled off. And that was my first experience. The difference is that in New York, folks deal with things like that, so folks in the neighborhood came down to straighten that out. So my next 4 years, I didn't have too much of a problem. But that was my first experience. So as I hearken back, while I don't harbor a racial animus because I didn't experience it on a continuing basis. I could go down to the park at 85th Street and play ball with the guys down there. I can go down to Astoria Pool, even though I knew when the time to leave. When I saw groups of guys forming, I knew it was time to get hat and leave the pool, but I never had a direct incident. So as I look back after I came here to Boston, as in terms of as a teenager, and see what happened, and through the civil rights movement, I was familiar with the civil rights movement. I was familiar with 64 with Cheney, Goodwin, and Schwerner in terms of what happened to them. But that was a distant situation. It didn't seem to affect me. I'm 14 years old. I didn't pay much attention. But as you get older and you look back and we study the history, understand the history, we say, yeah, that was going on in New York. When I understand that certain places, certain country clubs, we couldn't, which was 2 blocks away, folks set up a country club, we couldn't go there, but we didn't care. We had stuff in our neighborhood.
But hold up. So now this informed, exposed person ends up coming to Boston. He does wonderfully as an undergraduate student, activist as an undergraduate student, prepped the way for the next generation of students like myself to come here to Boston behind him. But then doesn't end there. Becomes one of the exposure opportunities for the next generation by going to law school in the 4th class of Northeastern University Law School, but isn't satisfied with that because what's going on around you is all these things in the Boston schools. And your destiny is become president of the local NAACP. And on top of that, you got a conference coming to the city, a national conference where you're going to expose everyone to a city called Boston that, because of this desegregation movement, has been labeled a whole lot of things. Did you ever think you were going to be right in the thick of that, talking to Judge Garrity in the schools, meeting these iconic people, the Ellens and the Ruth Batsons and all? What did that feel like for you as you reflect back on those times? What did that feel like for that kid who was a track guy, running up and down the street, put the track power to use when he was able to run down the street away from harm's way to get home safely, to get away from the buses. Now you're here, you're seeing some of that being played out in your own adult eyes or young adult eyes, because you were a youngster who tried to act older.
We all do
We
that.
all do, you know. So what did that feel like, for you? When you look back on that part of Joseph Feaster?
Well, Dr. Motley, great question. And I'll begin it this way. As I earlier said, I'm a total New Yorker. And my whole belief was I was going to come here, go to college.
Like all of us, go on.
I'm going back to New York
Right.
City.
Turn it out.
And that was my, even, Northeastern Law School. Northeastern has the co-op program. I even took my co-ops back in New York. But I took my co-op, my first co-op was at the Bedford-Stuyvesant Legal Services, because I wanted to check out this thing called law that I said I wanted to do. I had no familiarity. So I was always inquisitive. I always had to go and, I don't just say things. I always have to document. I'm a planner. So to answer the question, my belief was to go back to New York. But I was in the 4th graduating class for the new law school at Northeastern Law School, graduated in 75. And even there, I remember I was interviewing back in New York. I even went down to Frito-Lay's down in Texas. I'm glad I didn't go there. But in any event, the involvement with the desegregation in Boston, I was right there in the midst of it. My predecessor as president of the Boston branch, the late Tom Atkins, put out a call for law students to come and to help them investigate the situation. What happened primarily at South Boston High School. It was happening at other schools, Charlestown, Hyde Park, et cetera. So I put together a team of law students. So a number of us came to the branch. I headed up the effort in order to do this investigation, and in fact took that ride up the hill to South Boston High. So I met Winokur, who was the president up there. I met, in terms of Judge Garrity, et cetera, and we took these complaints of students being, assaulted, students. The teachers some of the teachers there were in the situation, and as you know, Phyllis, my wife, was there in 74, 75 at South Boston High. And that's a whole story of herself. She lived the desegregation movement there. Knew Ellen Jackson, the Snowdens, Ruth Batson, Paul Parks, all of those icons that were there. And never would have dreamed that I would have been engaged with that. Later, stayed with the branch, became a first vice president under Tom Atkins. When Tom Atkins went to be general counsel, I became the president of the Boston branch and was the president when the convention came here in 1982, and we're now having another one coming here in 2023 in a few months. So, that was a history. So I've lived a lot and seen a lot, and because I've been engaged in these things and worked with persons like you and others, I am trying to take my experiences and trying to shape things for the next generation. As I said, I'm 73 years old. And so my whole sense is, I'm not over the hill. I'm on the hill, but I ain't over it yet. And what I want to do is be able to be an influencer, to be a mentor to the next generation.
So yes. So what it felt like for me when I sort of saw all that was happening in Boston, it made it real. Because as a college student, and one of the reasons that I'm so on my class about topics of today, that they have to be aware of what's going on around them in the world, Boston has a way of insulating its college students from the rest of the world and everything else that's happening. You're just engaged in school and you don't know anything that's happening around you, particularly in those days. And so we were aware that Boston had a reputation, and we had sort of broke that down. And so you're feeling like nothing's impacted me because I'm a college kid. I'm above and I'm beyond that. But I remember 2 incidents. One, coming down Huntington Avenue, walking back to my apartments to go across the street to Museum Villa, which is across from the Museum of Fine Arts. And I look, and they had the entire block. There must have been 25 or 30, it seemed like that many, it probably was more, officers on horses that wouldn't let cars go left on the street. And you're curious as a college student because two things. One, that's where we went to get our food stamps so that we could eat, was up the street towards Roxbury. But they were keeping us away from going that way, but they were also keeping folk away from
was that
coming
St. Alphonsus
towards
Street?
us.
Was that St. Alphonsus Street?
St. Alphonsus, all those streets. They were just keeping it away from those neighborhoods and what was called the Back Bay at the time. The Back Bay was where the wealth was. We had no idea. We were living in the wealth. We didn't think it was as wealthy as it was as students, and we didn't know what was going on, but that brought it home. The second incident, I was playing softball as part of a team from Northeastern, and we're playing against the teams from Roxbury and Dorchester and all that. And we're at the old, Northeastern owns it now, but across from Bob the Chef's was the field, Columbus Avenue Field. And while we're there, all of a sudden, the fans start jumping up on the fence. And it was because someone had come with a car and ran down the entire sidewalk trying to hit people because of the anger and the racial strife that was going on in the city. Laughing, and it was a bunch of white kids in a car trying to run over a whole crowd of black people who were watching a softball game. And this was all connected to the feelings in town about desegregating the schools. And it brought it home because we're like, well, what are they doing with that? Because we were never exposed to that. We had our things on campus, as you know, that would happen between students. But a lot of times we would make that into, I just don't like you. Didn't get into all of the bottom line kinds of, the mental models of race and all that. I just can't stand you. No matter whether you were black, white, or blue or green, we're going to fight, right? And now your boys are all engaged in that. But seeing those horses and those police officers, we were like, whoa, what's up with that? And then seeing this people up on the fence crying and people that got hit by a car. Brought that home to us. And it was across the street and down the street from you all's office when it was on Columbus Avenue. Corner of Columbus Avenue.
Corner of Columbus Avenue and Mass Avenue. The NAACP office, that's correct, for all the years that I was involved up and through the mid-'80s. But, again, just talking about the time frame, and I thought back to, I mentioned about taking the complaints back in 1974. But I also remember that because I was around with Tom Atkins and Paul Parks and Ruth Batson and all of them, and they were planning this thing called the Swim-In. And I mean, if anyone goes back and looks at the papers from that time, and they were going to go over to Carson Beach, which was right in South Boston. And South Boston was the tip of resistance to the school,
at the University of Massachusetts,
school desegregation. And I remember Tom Atkins. I was working in the office then because I wasn't, I didn't become a member of the board until 1976 because I'm not a joiner. I'll do work, but I'm not necessarily going to join. But I did join the board in 1976 or 77. But this incident here had to be around 1975, and they were going to do the Swim-In. And Tom Atkins said to me, "Are you?" And I remember Olatunji came over, Elmer Lewis, and all of them went there. And I told, hey, I said earlier, I'm a kid from New York, and so I said, Tom, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go to this because I know you want this to be peaceful, and and if someone throws a rock at me, I'm picking it up and I'm throwing it back. So I didn't go. I manned the phones in the office. And in fact, they were attacked, but they were attacked by the police at that particular incident. So that reminded me so vividly in terms of there. And you go back, you read the articles from there. They were, the police turned on them. They were the ones being peaceful. There were others who were from the South Boston neighborhood who were attacking them. If you go back to, I remember the Ted Landsmark when he got stabbed in the face with the flag. I remember it on a City Hall Plaza. So a lot of what I know that when we did the convention in 1982, we had just had an incident with young black students from Philadelphia, from your state, who came to visit the monument and were attacked at the monument in Charlestown. So, all of these were the experiences, but you are correct. We were isolated if we chose to.
Right.
On that oasis called our campuses. We at Northeastern were the closest ones to the black community of all of the universities in the area. So we would be first impacted. I can remember the first thing said to me when I arrived in Northeastern in '67 is besides saying, look to the left, look to the right, one of y'all ain't gonna be there. That was one of the things they used to tell us. But the other one was, don't go across the tracks, which meant don't go into
Roxbury,
the black
Dorchester, Mattapan,
That's exactly that was the message that was delivered. So we stayed on Huntington Avenue. We didn't even go to Columbus Avenue. We may go down to, the by Bob the Chef's back then. So the experiences were quite vivid back then. I lived the desegregation and eventually went up and into the schools in Roxbury in order to speak to students.
So when you look at the schools and their evolution from that period to now, what advice would you have for those who are in those schools based on a life of really witnessing up close and personal some of the successes and some of the failures related to our schools? What would be some of the advice you would give going forward to teachers, families, particularly parents and families and students and that kind of thing? You've been an incredible mentor to lots of folk, and so you have a wealth of experience from both growing up, participating, leading, witnessing. So what would be some of that?
Yeah.
That you would lead?
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Motley. But I think I can say ditto on if I was describing you in terms of where you have been and the influence that you have been, not only in your Pittsburgh community, but clearly on Northeastern's campus, UMass, Boston, and Boston generally. So, I mean, you are a credit to what we have engaged in and struggled for here. I describe the education this way, and I can't say too much because Phyllis always told me, stay out of this educational, political conversation. But there are four components to the educational system to me. It's the educators, administrators, parents, and students. And unfortunately, and I described it as a four-legged chair, the legs aren't even. And so as a result of that, it's unsteady, and it has been even there. Yes, desegregation provided financial resources. Yes, desegregation provided black teachers opportunities in the school. But what is happening is the educational component.
Hold up, Joseph Feaster. Now, that's normal in most of our homes, that a chair would be wobbly. And what we would do would be put something under the leg.
That's right. You try to shore it up. That's right.
What is that thing that we need to put under that leg to sort of keep it from wobbling going forward?
For me, based upon, and I hearken back, and one listening to this will see consistency. The foundation for me is the home. The foundation for me is at the home. All I think where I have risen to, yes, I've been influenced by other things, but it started in the home with my mom and dad telling me, as you said, you're brilliant, you're great, be an achiever. That spurred me on. If we have that foundation, there's nothing that can be done at the school. It's folks like you and me who will deal with the other policy issues, try to put, assist those people as we do. You were former chancellor of UMass Boston. You did it there. You did it at Northeastern University. We provide the grounding. So if I was to succinctly respond to your question is, we got to balance out the legs of that chair. Now, how it's done, I'm not sure. Yes, you can put something under it, but again, we need to make sure that those legs get evened out.
So it sounds like from this conversation that exposure opportunities, the ones that come outside of the school. So you, like you say, your bride always says, don't get into that political conversation around schools. However, schools can't do it by themselves.
That's right.
School is what happens all around you every day, including those four sectors you talked about, parents, students, administrators, and all of that, right? However, you were running track. You were engaged in music. You were engaged in theater. You were doing things back then because your parents told you to go get involved because they were busy raising you and finding the resources to raise you.
Correct.
And for me, it's the same thing. I always talk to schools about making sure that there's engagement opportunities for their students that don't only consist of what happens in the classroom. Exposure, 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 because it opens up your brain to the possibilities, and it allows for you to have that defense mechanism against all of those things that come into play that are designed to keep you in a specific space, one that doesn't allow for your excellence to sort of continue to move forward. So as we think about closing this conversation today, which is always too short when I get to talking with you,
Yeah.
tell me something that you want to leave as a gift to this conversation.
I want to encourage folks to show up. One of the things I was thinking about was, notwithstanding how I may rail or against the educational construct, I'm not going to give up. I'm going into the schools as a black man, trying to make sure that those young black boys and girls understand that they can make a difference. So my reality is, in terms of the struggle continues. We may not be where we want to be, but we ain't where we've been. And so we need to continue the dialogue. We need to get in. I'd say to folks, as we understand here in the 21st century, they need to participate in the political process. They need to be taking part in voting. They need to be those presidents of those classes, even at that particular level. And while we were in school, I was an officer in my high school, and there were only maybe 10 black students that went to the whole school of 100 and something. But you show up, you get the job done, and you do it. I think that I would want to spend a lot of the time working with parents. And I understand there are a lot of single-parent households. We need to make sure Shore provide the type of support there. So from a policy standpoint, I think that we need some surrogate situations to assist in those particular efforts. So, I'm still in the fight, and I'm going to continue in the fight. And it's been a pleasure being able to engage in that battle with you.
As it has been for me with you. A 17-year-old kid was walking down the street in front of Leon Street back all those years ago, and they said, that guy goes to law school. And that showed me that it's possible. And I think showing up to show these young people and modeling that kind of excellence for them, no matter what stage we are in terms of this intergenerational love, is something that we need to continue to do. Thanks for the opportunity to sit down with you and unpack some of this. It's not only therapeutic and helpful, it's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experience.
Well, Dr. Motley, thank you for inviting me to join you on this StoryCorps American experience. It has been wonderful, and this conversation will continue.
Thank you.
Can I ask you guys one question?
Yes.
Back during your time as growing adults, you guys found support, right? You guys had a confidence in yourselves. A lot of the students in Boston didn't have that, especially during the desegregation years. Do you guys have a responsibility, do you think, especially seeing what happened here in Boston? So what responsibility do you feel?
But I don't think it was because of that that we felt we had a responsibility. I think that for me, the responsibility becomes because we're sort of continuing to build the circle. And that circle was all those individuals. And they weren't just black. They were everyone who reached out to give their souls to me. My high school basketball coach drove me to the airport. I had never been on a plane, but he made sure that I made every plane that to visit colleges because I was a student athlete. And so he made sure of that. But then the police officers in the neighborhood, some black, some white, made sure I stayed out of trouble. The athletes had to live in your neighborhood at the time. So Roberto Clemente, Willie Stargell, those guys, Al Oliver married my best friend's sister. So we were at the games with the Pirates all the time. So those exposure opportunities, models of excellence for us, and it doesn't have to be those kind of individuals. It's keeping your child engaged and exposing them. We have a program here in the city called the Paul Robeson Institute for Positive Self-Development. That program was developed by concerned black men out of the fear that black boys were being destroyed in schools. And so we decided to go into the schools, teach the classes, expose these kids to us as role models, but also as mentors. And we didn't want to replace the fathers. We didn't want to replace the teachers. We just wanted to make them understand there was an expectation of excellence, that every time that child is in front of you, you're supposed to show up. And our presence sort of dictated that. I think our presence today in these circles dictates that folk have to show up. Many of them are our mentees or contemporaries.
Well,
that are in these roles.
Well, for me, I didn't see it as a responsibility. I saw it as a ministry. It was my ministry in order to make sure, and again, maybe it goes back to my athletic, in the sense of track and field. I ran relays, and I had to pass the baton, and each one of us had to run our portion of the race. I ran. Well, see, back then it was yards. They got meters now, but it was 880. I ran 880. Second leg sometimes, anchor sometimes. But it was somebody had to pass the baton on. So my belief is you got to pass the baton on to get someone else to run their leg of the race. And none of us can win because you drop the baton. I don't care how fast I ran my leg. If the baton gets dropped, the team loses. So my whole concept was, and you hear this cliche, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, I'm part of the village. I may even be considered a village leader, but nonetheless, in terms of I am going to stay in there. And, the other thing is, Dr. Motley, when you and I came up, the word respect existed in our community. Anybody if I go back to New York now, and even at 73, and I run into Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, if they're living, they remain that.
Right.
So I want to bring back, Aretha Franklin used to say RESPECT. I think a lot of it starts back in terms of respect. And I think if we start there'll be a lot of positive things that we can bring to bear. And so that's what I foster when I go young folks in terms of doing that. And, have a relatively good success rate because they, as you said, with the young men and women that you have tutored over the course of and mentored over the course of your career, they have now excelled in meaningful ways
Yes.
because of their relationship with you. And I feel the same with mentees that I've had. So I'm going to say I'm going to show up until I can't show up anymore.